All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning into our talk entitled, Does Learner Engagement in Face-to-Face and Synchronous Text-Based Chat Predict Spanish L2 Learning? So engagement is a construct that has been extensively researched in educational psychology, and it's been able to tell us a little bit about important outcomes of interest, such as participation in learning activities, learners' grades and GPA, their scores on standardized tests, and their graduation rates. And most of this research has occurred in K through 12 schooling environment. Engagement is something that requires energy and effort, and it drives learning. But research that examines its specific link to learning is minimal, but very much needed.
Yeah. So as Carly said, we can all agree that engagement is some sort of measurement that measures engagement in or effort in learning and effort in learning. Unfortunately, that's about where the consensus ends. So when we look at operationalizing engagement, so in educational psychology, engagement suffers from what's called the jingle-jangle problem. So the jingle problem is when the same terms, refer to different constructs, and the jangle problem is when different terms are referring to the same constructs. So what we see is that a lack of definitional clarity about what we're talking about really complicates the study of engagement. We can also generally agree that engagement represents a multifaceted index of how involved the student is in learning. But beyond that, there's a lack of agreement on the number of dimensions, the type of dimensions, and if the engagement is an outcome or a process in learning. When we look specifically at SLA research, we can find indexes of engagement that have been investigated under other names. So for example, cognitive engagement has been investigated widely. We just haven't called it cognitive engagement. We've referred to it as language-related episodes or noticing. Within task-based research, what we generally see is that those researchers have conceptualized engagement as an outcome of task-based interaction. And then they've investigated how task features influence engagement, specifically how mode, content, or choice influences how engaged learners are in the task-based interaction. And then within individual difference research, we've seen that there's been a focus on the description of the qualities of engagement, and that it's assumed there that it's a process. And we've examined the contextually determined and dynamic nature of engagement. So Svalberg was the first to incorporate engagement into the SLA research, and she proposed that engagement with language possesses cognitive, social, and affective dimensions, while Philip and Duchesne also advocate for behavioral dimension, which is based on the educational research. Recent theoretical descriptions of L2 engagement affirm these 4 dimensions. However, L2 research varies widely in the number and types of dimensions included. So we have some studies like Fung et al. Who consider just 1 dimension of engagement, and we have others like Sillis and Phillip who consider up to 4. L2 engagement development. So what we see is that there's a gap in understanding how L2 engagement relates to L2 development. So some studies consider how L2 engagement relates to language use, like fluency during task completion, or language achievement overall, like reading and comprehension at a certain point, but without so much of a developmental focus. Dow 2017 offers evidence that cognitive engagement is a predictor of question development during task-based interaction, which represents an important exception to this trend. And then what is missing from the literature is empirical work that examines the presupposed relationship between L2 engagement and L2 development.
Great. So as Daniel was saying, what's missing here is this in the literature is a link between engagement and learning, a study that systematically investigates that. So our study builds on work by Baralt et al. 2016, which was an initial look at engagement in the computerized environment, specifically synchronous computer-mediated communication, which was text-based chat, which is what we use as well. And our study is the first study to explore how cognitive, affective, and also behavioral engagement relate specifically to L2 learning in both modalities, so face-to-face and text-based chat. We look at 3 specific types of learning. We look at Spanish locative copula, Spanish vocabulary, and Spanish locative prepositions. And these structures were selected because they differ in terms of their communicative salience. They differ in terms of how essential they are to complete the task, and they differ in terms of learners' prior knowledge. So our first research question asks, are there significant differences between face-to-face and text-based chat regarding presence of behavioral, cognitive, and affective engagement? And then secondly, is there a change over time for learning of these 3 structures? And if so, to what extent do the 3 engagement types predict this learning, and are patterns similar in both communication modes? So 16 learners of Spanish at the intermediate level completed 2 information gap tasks. One was completed in face-to-face and one completed in chat, counterbalanced with an interlocutor. And in these tasks, learners had a picture and the interlocutor had the same picture. The difference was the interlocutor's picture had items in the picture cut out of them, and the task was that the learner needed to describe the location of the items so that the interlocutor could place the cutouts back into the picture so that both pictures matched. So to measure learning, we have 2 types of assessments. We used an open oral production task in which learners viewed 2 rooms, a kitchen and a living room, similar but not the same as the treatment task, and they described location of items in the room. And then in our guided oral production task, learners viewed a picture of one object. It was a mouse, and they had to say where the mouse was located in relation to other objects in that room. So the second task was more controlled than the first task. So for our coding, we utilized 2 instruments to code for engagement. We utilized the task-based interactions and post-task questionnaires. We coded them for the 3 types of engagement, and then an engagement score was generated for each participant. I'll talk a little bit more about how we did that in a moment. And those scores allowed us to analyze them in relationship to learning, which we operationalize as gains made from the pre-test to the post-test on those 3 Spanish structures. So as an example of behavioral engagement, we define behavioral engagement as the number of turns produced per participant, which has been done in prior research. A turn is defined as an utterance by one speaker bounded by other speakers' turns. And in the chat here, each sent message counted as a turn. So we have an excerpt here from our chat of one of the task interactions, a Spanish participant 4 interacting with the Spanish interactor, which is the interlocutor. And we see here 3 turns by the interlocutor and then 4 turns by the participant, each bound by the other turn, which was the sent message. So for cognitive engagement, we have here an example in face-to-face, and we had different measures for cognitive engagement. One of them was language-related episode, where a learner comments on or questions their language use. And so here we have the participant here. They don't know the word for countertop, and so they're asking in Spanish, how do you say this thing? ¿Cómo se llama esta cosa? They're questioning their language use. There's the LRE, and they motion with their hands countertop. And this motioning or gestures is used to support language production. So we coded that also as cognitive engagement. And so the interlocutor follows up with the targeted form, mostrador, countertop. But then in the next turn, the participant they repeat that form and they use it in their production, which is an example of modified output, which we also coded as cognitive engagement. We see another example of modified output below with the word toaster. And so what we did was we added up all of these instances of coded cognitive engagement, and we then divided them by the total number of turns to arrive at a percentage, which was an engagement index or an engagement score per participant. Okay, great. So then for affective engagement, as we mentioned, students completed a post-task questionnaire asking them how they felt during the task, what their experience was like. So they were asked to choose 3 adjectives to describe their experience completing the tasks in both face-to-face and chat. So some examples of positive adjectives that were generated were things like relaxing, creative, educational, whereas more negative adjectives that were generated were isolated, stressful, and tedious. And so what we did was that we assigned each participant an average affective engagement score by dividing their total number of positive adjectives, their positive adjectives by 3 to get that average affective engagement score. So for our analysis, we were able to use those engagement scores to relate to learning. And so for research question 1, we first looked at whether the 2 modes were different regarding the presence of the 3 engagement types. And we used paired samples t-test to determine whether there were significant differences between the 2 modes. And then for our second research question, which asked whether learning occurred over time, whether engagement predicted such learning, and whether there were any differences in this relationship according to the communication mode, we used a repeated measures ANOVA, which gave us 6 independent variables, 6 engagement types according to mode. That's 3 types of engagement times 2 modes. And then our dependent variable were the scores on the pre and post tests. So for our results for the first research question asking about engagement according to mode, we found that the face-to-face mode led to significantly higher cognitive and affective engagement as compared to CMC, as compared to chat. So you can see here more cognitive engagement in face-to-face compared to chat. And this difference was significant with a large effect size. And we also find more effective engagement in face-to-face mode compared to chat. Also, the difference being significant with a large effect size as well. So for our second research question, which first looked at learning overall, we found that learners significantly did improve their learning, particularly on oral production of copula and vocabulary, as well as their guided oral production of preposition. So we can see here on the oral production of copula, the gain score. There we see that gain score, and we do see that was significant. And it did have a small to medium effect size. And then for oral production of vocabulary, this gain score was also significant with a very large effect size. And then for guided oral production of prepositions, this gain score was also significant with a medium effect size. So for the second part of our second research question, which asked whether such learning related to engagement and mode, we found that affective engagement in face-to-face significantly predicted learners' improvement on oral production of Spanish copula only. So one type of engagement in one mode on one assessment on one structure. And this finding was in fact significant.
So going back to research question 1, looking at engagement and mode, we found greater cognitive and affective engagement in face-to-face. This echoed findings from Baralt 2014 and Baralt et al. 2016. In Baralt et al. 2016, which was dyadic learner-learner interaction, either in face-to-face or CMC, social engagement and interlocutor familiarity both played a role. In our study, learners interacted with the same unfamiliar expert interlocutor instructor, so we tried to address that interlocutor familiarity issue with our study. In ours, the greater cognitive and affective engagement may have been due to learners simply being more accustomed to face-to-face interaction. All of our learners were taking courses in person. So Baralt et al. Had 2 different classes, one in person, one completely online, and the online students then were paired to interact with each other in SCMC or face-to-face respectively. Ours were all in person, and they actually had very little experience at that time chatting or doing any type of interaction in their L2 online. And while our results were different according to mode, there were still notable cognitive engagement in both modes in our study. So even though we didn't see the same magnitude of engagement in online as in face-to-face, we're hypothesizing that perhaps we had a lab-based study and we had an expert interlocutor. So both of these components or both of these factors may heighten cognitive engagement in a way that we didn't see in a study with learners interacting with each other. We also would like to echo Gonzalez-Uret and Ortega in 2014, who very wisely said and predicted that one cannot simply take a face-to-face task and carry out online without considering the uniqueness of each mode. And we all have been teaching online and know that this is very much the case. When it comes to research question 2, which looked at both, is there evidence of learning, as well as what is the predictive power, if any, of engagement for learning? A reminder that all of our students learned, and they learned in terms of all 3 structures that we varied in terms of, that we chose based on their varying salience for communication value. And then we also found that only an affective engagement in face-to-face predicted copula learning in open production. So a specific type of engagement in a specific mode for a specific structure in a specific production type task. But we'll talk about why that's meaningful in a moment. What we found here supports arguments that affective factors may influence and or facilitate L2 learning. And this also is what Baralt et al. Found when we found affective engagement in face-to-face facilitating attention to form. In this study, we found a predictive link for the most difficult structure and the more difficult learning measure. So for us, it really appeared to be the most important factor when learners learn this challenging structure for use in this difficult task. It's even hard to talk about. And the link that we found between affective but not cognitive engagement is similar to what Wigglesworth and Storch found, and the opposite of Dow. So there's clearly more research needed. We also believe that our students' high affective engagement in face-to-face may have influenced other cognitive processes that we did not capture by our LREs, modified output, and the other types of measurements, the ways that we operationalized cognitive engagement. In terms of limitations in future research, there's a lot that could be done because our research was pre-pandemic, as I talk about in a moment. First, without retrospective measures, we can really only speculate that affective engagement may have otherwise affected cognitive engagement. That's what we're guessing, but we need to have stimulated recall protocols or post-task interviews, a measure of what was this link between affective engagement and learning? Was there affective to cognitive and then learning, or was it simply affective to learning? We also want to recognize that our operationalization of affective engagement via 3 questions is less than ideal, although it did follow the research at the time. Future studies could conduct post-task interviews or more dynamically, regularly throughout the interaction. So Dow and Sato looked at social and affective engagement, and they regularly prompted students to record their engagement at 5-minute intervals. And the elephant in the Zoom room is that our study was conducted pre-pandemic, where text-based chat was the norm, and our learners had little to no experience interacting in their L2 online. And it seems crazy to say that our study was published in 2021, and this is how different we are a year later. But we must research how this cultural shift impacts how engagement in L2 learning takes place and the myriad factors at play. So although it may feel a bit out of date with SCMC, we would argue that this demonstrates really even more a critical need for research, looking at 2 different types of modes and how learners engage and potentially learn based on this engagement. Our finding that L2 learning occurred in both modes and regardless of engagement supports the facilitative nature of task-based interaction. All 3 of us do task-based research, so we're all thrilled with this result to share with you. And despite our controlling for task, interaction, and feedback, which is why we had the same interlocutor interact each time, there were still differences in cognitive and affective engagement, and more so in face-to-face. And again, given this predictive nature that we found for affective engagement for learning and face-to-face, we really need to have more nuanced research. And I want to point out again, the nature of video-based interaction and or video-based chat. One of the other studies that Dow et al. Have recently done, they looked at how does video-based interaction like Zoom versus chat matter for interaction. And of course, the entire symposium that we're part of today can help answer these questions. Our study demonstrated that, again, face-to-face led to significantly more cognitive and affective engagement and even predicted learning, at least for copula and open production for affective engagement. And future research must be expanded to reflect our post-pandemic reality, where online learning contexts and different types of SCMC are increasingly frequent. Thank you all so much for tuning in to our presentation. We are eager to engage with you either now in the open chat if technology allows. Otherwise, you're welcome to email us, and I'm also here present at the conference. Thanks again.